Eh, Hello, everyone. Welcome, everyone, for joining us. Buenas tardes a todas, a todos, todes. We are going to start shortly in a couple of minutes. Vamos a empezar en un par de minutos. This webinar will be mostly in Spanish with the option of interpretation into English. So you can go down at the bottom of your screen and choose the interpretation option on the globe for English if you need, or if into Spanish if that's what you need. Este webinar será principalmente en español. Entonces, bueno, si necesitan interpretación, existe la opción abajo en el globo terráqueo para elegir el idioma que necesitan. Y estaremos empezando en un minuto. Así que muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Bueno, vamos a comenzar este webinar sobre los mecanismos de protección y la situación de personas defensoras en México, coorganizado por PBI Canadá, PBI México y también el Espacio
and the
OSC.
Space
Y bueno,
USC.
así que muchas gracias por
So
acompañarnos
thank you so much
en
for
el
being
día de
here
hoy en
today
este evento.
in this event.
Bueno, como ya les comenté, está la opción de la
Before, you have the option of choosing interpreting, and we would like
agradeciendo y
to start
reconociendo la labor y
thanking
el trabajo de las
the
intérpretes
work
que nos
of our
acompañan hoy, a
interpreters,
Sandra y Begoña. Así que
Sandra and Begoña. So
muchas gracias
thank you so
por
much
apoyarnos en
for
este espacio
supporting us in this
para
space
facilitar la
to
comunicación
make it
de
easy
este
that we
evento.
communicate in
Mi
this
nombre es
event. My
Javier
name is
Garate.
Javier Garate.
Yo hago en mi día a día hago parte
In my day-to-day
de
life,
en mi
I'm
trabajo
part
trabajo
of
con
my
Global
job. I
Witness
work with Global
como asesor
Witness
político
as
aquí en la oficina
a
en
US
Washington,
policy
D.C.,
ambassador at the Washington, D.C.
trabajando en
office.
temas de personas
I
defensoras
work
del
in
ambiente y el
human rights
territorio.
defenders
Y
of land
también
and
hago parte
territory.
del
And I also
directorio
I
de
am
PBI
part
Canadá
of the PBI
y
Canada Board
anteriormente a
of
Global Witness
Directors. And
fui parte
formerly,
del equipo de PBI de Brigada de Paz
as
Internacional
I
en
was part of
Colombia.
the PBI
Así que bueno,
Colombia team
un honor para mí poder
as a
estar
global witness.
facilitando,
So
moderando
thank you
este webinar
so
el
much for being here. I'm
día
really
de hoy, que
happy to
será
be
un
here
webinar de una hora, quizás
facilitating this
nos
webinar. We're
alarguemos
going to be
un
an
poco más
hour.
para
It'll take a bit
escuchar de nuestras
longer
maravillosas
so we can listen
panelistas
to our wonderful
sobre la situación
panelists
que se está
about the
dando
situation that is
en
happening
México
in
frente
Mexico
a los riesgos que tienen las personas
with the risks
defensoras y
that
cómo
human rights defenders are facing,
mecanismo
and how the
federal y
mechanism,
también
the
cómo
federal
a nivel
mechanisms,
estatal
and also
funciona
the
la
state
protección
mechanism
para personas
works for the
defensoras
protection for
México
human rights
y los
defenders in
riesgos
Mexico,
que
and the
enfrentan personas
risks
defensoras
that
y
human rights
periodistas
defenders are
también
facing, and journalists as well,
frente a y la respuesta frente
and
de
their
este mecanismo.
response of this
En nuestro
mechanism.
trabajo en Global
In
Witness,
our
llevamos ya
work
13 años
in Global
documentando
Witness, we've
ataques a
been
personas
documenting for
específicamente
13
defensoras
years
del territorio y el
the
medio
attacks
ambiente.
on
En estos
human rights defense,
13
specifically of
años
land and
de
the environment.
documentación, desde el
And in these
2012
13 years
hasta
of
las cifras que tenemos del
documentation from
2024, contamos
2012 to
con
2024,
222
we count on
personas
222
defensoras de la
people
tierra y el
that have
ambiente que han
human
sido
rights defenders
asesinadas o
of land and
desaparecidas en
territory that have
México.
been assassinated or
19 de
forcibly
esas,
disappeared in
19%
Mexico.
de esas personas que han
19%
sido
of those
asesinadas o
people that have been
desaparecidas
murdered
son de población
are
de comunidades indígenas
belong to
y bueno,
indigenous communities.
y sabemos que muchos de estos casos
And we
están
know that
relacionados
many of these
con el tema
cases
de la
are related
existencia
with the topic of
la industria
persistence
extractiva,
of the
minera y demás, ¿no?
extractive
Entonces sabemos
industries, the mining
desde
industries.
como muchos saben
So,
que México es uno
as
de los
you all know,
países
Mexico is
más
one of those
complejos y
countries
donde
that
la
are
labor de
more
defender el
complex, where the work
territorio,
of defending
la labor
territory and
de defender
defending
la comunidad y sus
and communities and their rights is a risk, is a danger. And in that case, we want to talk about the situations that they're facing and the possible responsibilities to and how to strengthen them. I would like to start in presenting our panelists that are going to come. They're going to be here with us today. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to start with Mario Hurtado Cardoso. He is part of the space of civil society organizations for the protection of human rights defenders and journalists, Espacio OSC. Mario is an activist, is a lawyer, a researcher, and a great communicator as well. So thank you so much for being here with us, Mario. Then we also count with Elizabeth Mosqueda Rivera. She is part of the team of the Consorcio for Parliamentary Dialogue and Equity in Oaxaca. Consorcio Oaxaca is an organization that is a member of Espacio OSC, and she's a beneficiary of protection measures. We have here today also Hugo Arreola Galvan with the Ceferino Ladrillero Human Rights Center. It's an organization that's also part of the Espacio OSC, and he's also a beneficiary of protection measures because of the risks, the situation, because of the work that he carries. And finally, we have Aleida Quintana with the National Network of Human Rights Defenders. She's a defender of human rights, a feminist, and a social anthropologist. So, luxury panel that we have today. And without further ado, we're going to start with the questions. My first question is for you, Mario. We've got 5 minutes to answer. Can you tell us why is it necessary to have protection policies for human rights defenders in Mexico? Why is it so necessary to prevent this violence? Well, first of all, it's so nice to see you, Javier, and wonderful to say hello to my colleagues that are here today, and and of course my acknowledgement, my thanks to PBI Mexico, PBI Canada, and of course everybody that is connected because of their interest, to listen to your support, because I think human rights defenders have higher risks. Well, and about your question and your argument, Mexico is one of the most dangerous countries in the region and the world for the defense of human rights and the exercise of the journalism profession. According to the OCHA office in Mexico, from January of 2015 and December 2025, 181 human rights defenders have been assassinated in entire Mexico, and 89 journalists. At the same time, there were 2 people and 1 media worker, and 43 human rights defenders were forcibly disappeared. Human rights defenders that face a great risk are the people that defend land and territory, the rights of indigenous peoples, and of course, the rights of women. In the case of journalism, the greater risks that we've identified are mostly in those who cover policy work and police work. And an important report is the Derecho Ambiental Organization, which is part of the OSC space, suffered 94 aggressions, with 36 specific aggressions and 27 mortal aggressions. And regarding journalists, and Article 19, which is another organization that is part of the space, from 2024 to 2025, they documented the murder of 12 journalists that were victims of lethal aggressions and that are allegedly collected with their work. So that's the point, that's the tip of the iceberg. But under those aggressions, we have other type of aggressions like threats, forced displacement, criminalization, harassment in the courts, digital violence and other aggressions that sadly have not been able to reduce and make their work as human rights defenders very hard, and the right that we'll have to have a safe environment. So the 14 organizations that integrate this Espacio OSC space, we have articulated, documenting, and established joint actions with the civil society, always putting in the center the violence against human rights defenders and the need that the Mexican state will face its obligations in the protection of human rights defenders. As a result of those efforts from 2012, there was a federal law, which is the law for the protection of human rights defenders and journalists, that creates a protection mechanism in which right now gives measures to more than 2,000 beneficiaries, the people that are currently at risk. At that moment, only Colombia and Brazil counted with programs and policies for protection in the region. And in that sense, the Mexican law takes those good practices, those best practices for those two countries, and goes forward and establishes a governance model in a network with the participation of multiple stakeholders with protection with protection duties as the participation of civil society with the right to vote. And so there are several actions in prevention, like contingency plans, etc. We think that this law from 2012 is a win from civil society, is significant advance, not just for Mexico, but for the continent. And sadly, we're one of the most violent for human rights defense. And we also have to recognize that it's been able to save lives, it gives protection, and the creation of regulations locally. So apart from this federal law from 2012 that I mentioned, I wanted to share that in Mexico, there were like 20 instances of protection that were created with laws, decrees, or agreements, executive agreements. However, we should also say that even though there's this existence of these regulations, it's still not enough with other structural favors that still allow violence to still happen in the national level. So from Espacio OSC, we recognize those advances, but we also point out those gaps. And we've been fostering a proposal for public policies that would give protection and guarantees for the exercise of the right to defend the human rights and the freedom of expression, not just protecting the life and integrity of the people that are at risk, but also to contribute to build the construction of an environment that makes it safer and fostering this activity in these 13 years since the mechanism was created. So that's a strengthened actions of prevention to work in the derogation of legal frameworks that create risk, acts of recognition, statistical data, among others. So that proposal also includes not just strengthening the instances in which justice, but we should say also that in Mexico, sadly, many of those crimes, 90% go unpunished, and many of the lethal aggressions come with they have been denounced before having reported officially, and still the aggression happened. So these are underreported, but to increase the reporting of these aggressions and violations of human rights violations, we think that it's fundamental that these situations are not happen. And to finish, I think it's important to answer that question, that the compliance from the government, from the Mexican state is not a favor, is a duty. Prevention, protection, respect, research, these are duties from states, and so the public policies cannot be limited just to the security approach, but they have to focus on different structural factors that make this violence against human rights defenders and journalists, and recognize them as subjects of rights and not just simply the object of protection. A real public policy should guarantee that every person that defends the human rights in a free way without threats or any negative repercussions. And we've always offered a commitment to give support and technical assistance when there is political will in the federal level and in federative entities to go hand in hand for this comprehensive policy in the sense. So here, my first intervention here, and talk of this mechanism and this story from 2012 and the proposal that as civil society was presented all along. This would be my thing. Thank you so much, Mario, for this
Thank you,
introduction.
Mario, for giving us an introduction to this subject. And it's very interesting. Yes, the policies need to look at the whole picture and the whole cycle. We're looking at when we're looking at violence from the causes, the context that the violence happens in, and also the responses, but also the ways that these attacks can be receive reparations and for prevention, and not just these reactive activities. You need to look at it in a more integrated way to be able to prevent the violence in the first place. Thank you for your response. So now I'll turn to Hugo. So can you, who's from the Ladrillo Human Rights Center, and you're doing an enormous Febrero Ladrillo Human Rights Center, and so you're working with lots of people who face lots of risk. What are the groups and entities who are threatening human rights defenders and journalists? What are the interests behind these attacks? And so, yeah, what's the work that you do when you accompany communities? What is it you see there? So thank you. I'd just like to reiterate the hellos to all of the panelists here and also our colleagues with PBI Canada and Mexico. So yeah, we look at the actors, who are the people that are threatening and attacking human rights defenders and journalists. So human rights defense is very, very diverse. It's not the same if you're talking about defending the right to private property, or the people who are defending the right to territories, or the madre buscadoras, the people who are seeking the disappeared people, disappeared family members, or people who are facing internal forced displacement. So these are all very different sorts of ways of defending rights, and so there are different sorts of human rights that they're defending, and so they're very different contexts. So, and yeah, Mario's already mentioned the work that the Central Mexican Center for Environmental Defense, and there's been work to identify the different things that are involved in defending environmental rights. And so in numbers, in 2024, there were 3 different agents who were key. That's the government, private companies, and organized crime. So these are 3 key groups that are threatening human rights and defenders. And so it can be a bit abstract sometimes, but so the federal government has focused, attacked human rights defenders, particularly in environmental cases, through criminalization. And then the territorial work that we do from the Febrero Ladrillero Center is documenting the activities of government, so the municipal government, so like the local governments and their activities and that. And so they have a lot of contact in the people that we accompany and the organizations that we accompany. And so, yeah, they're often, the perpetrators of the attacks are often part of the municipal government. And so what is the role of municipal government in protection policy? Because it's not just the state that needs to be in contact with the people, but if we think about the election plans and the mechanisms that the federal mechanism can implement, so if we think about how it's being if it, like, can it be can you avoid the municipal involvement if they're the ones that are the aggressors? And so if you're giving like, municipal peace patrols, for example, as a protection measure, if they're the aggressors, it's not something that works. And so that's on the state level. And so then if we look at companies and the role of companies, and we're talking about documented aggressions against human rights defenders and journalists, we see that private security companies or with links with cells of criminal organizations or organized crime organizations. And so you see this other actor that can become involved and unfortunately plays an active role and key role in the attacks against human rights defenders, and that's the organized crime, right? And so also the diversification of crime in Mexico. So we're talking about cartels or drugs trafficking. It doesn't really describe the reality in Mexico. It's much more complex than that. And so defending human rights in areas where you've got a heavy criminal presence, people are extremely vulnerable, and it's a very broad form of vulnerability. We can't just talk about, like, if you're looking after, you're trying to defend your forest in your community. So, but you can have criminal cells or groups activity like working in these woods as well. So it makes the whole work of your defense much more complex. And so if we look at different illegal activities that have given rise to many different sorts of criminal activity. And so we have to look at how these different actors, so the state, private companies, and organized crime will work together to create this very complex situation for human rights defenders. And so yes, and so when we go back to the state, we'd like, yes, that's what I'd say there. It's a complex mix. So thank you, Hugo, for giving us an idea of the very complex situation that Mexico faces in this, with the different levels of the state. But we're talking about a state that has to be the guarantor or protector, but it's a state that at the same time, in the different levels, it has it's responsible to care for the people, but at the same time it's playing a part in the attacks. It's something that we see a lot in Latin American countries and around the world, unfortunately. And so now I wanted to pose a question to Aleida. And so I think Mario and Hugo has told us a bit about the different groups involved, the most vulnerable groups in Mexico for the work that they do. But the whole complex network of the attacks that these people face. But so with these sectors, what are the sectors for human rights defenders and journalists? Who are the ones that are most at risk? And what are the impacts that these communities and organizations face from the National Network of Defenders? And so, and are these impacts differentiated? Do people face different impacts depending on their specific identities? So what are the ones on the first line who are facing and suffering the impacts of these attacks? And what are the impacts of that in the long term? So thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for being inviting me to speak on this panel today. I think it's extremely important, particularly given seeing what Mexico is facing right now and the world now. We're at these crisis moments, like, it's really, really important to have a look. We've always looking and trying to see what things what things are shared and how we can best work together in these complex times. I'd like to start with the National Network of Human Rights Defenders. It's a network that responds to the threats that human rights defenders and journalists face who are at risk for the work that they do in Mexico. We've got 445 human rights defenders and journalists, and we form part of a of the Mesoamerican network, which is a more regional network. And so there's various things I want to share, some data in response to your question about what are the most dangerous sectors to work in if you're a human rights defender or a journalist. And so we've got a register of attacks. So this was a pioneering strategy that we've created a platform to be able to record all of this and to analyze the gender, the attacks against women, women human rights defenders and journalists, and also people from sexogeneric, non-binary and other genders. So 1,600, over 1,600 against human rights defenders and journalists. And so the sorts of aggressions that they faced was the limitations or from communicating or limitations on the communications. That's mainly journalists, but also human rights defenders who, when they're accompanying people, seek information, request for information, and they're prevented from that. So other forms of attacks is the physical attacks, threats, surveillance in their daily lives. During this time, we documented some serious attacks. So there have been some killings in the network, 7 feminicides and a number of trans feminicides, another killing, also accusations, criminalization. Criminalization of both criminal and administrative in form. So yeah, and also this trumped up applications. So the criminalization of people is very common. And so in Mexico, city of Mexico has got the highest level of attacks. Guerrera, Veracruz, Jalisco, another in Baja California. And so the right to information and the freedom of expression, 48% of attacks. The right of reparation is also high up on the list. So that is particularly something that the women seeking their disappeared. And then the right to defend territory, environment, and other sorts of environmental goods. So the most common attacks in our database was the authorities were the federal, municipal and state, with 48% of the people documented. Here, we also found people who could be linked to organized crime, but it's difficult to identify them because of the complexity of the situation. And then online attacks with 11%, and that's a really big concern too, because there's an increase in digital attacks against human rights defenders and journalists. And then the killings, which is the worst attack that you can face, and the 58 feminicides from 2019 to 2025. And in 2025, we recorded 4 against the buscadoras, the people looking for their disappeared people, 2 against land and environmental defenders, and 1 against a trans defender who is a defender of LGBTIQ plus rights. And so there are other attacks. So we're looking at the feminicides in Jalisco with 4 cases, 4 killings, Sinaloa with 1, Zacatecas with another case, and Chiapas with another killing. And so we've also documented a situation that's very concerning relating to the disappearance of human rights defenders in Mexico. In the last year, we recorded 3 defenders who have been killed, female defenders that have been killed, and they have not been reappeared. They are all 2 buscadoras and 1 trans, and then there's 2 in Sinaloa and 1 in Oaxaca. And so we were talking about the impacts, and then I will close my response, what we've identified is that female defenders really suffer because of the work that they do, because they are facing structural violence. They are living under a continuous repression. It affects all of their different facets and has massive impacts on their and social emotional state, depression, emotional exhaustion, and in some cases they're also facing things that make their situation worse. So with the buscadoras, they face a huge impact because of the structural violence they face and the institutional violence that they face. We've also documented physical impacts, not only because of this exhaustion, but also the physical attacks that they face and the harassment that they face, arbitrary detention, other sorts of persecution that leave them physically injured, that makes it harder for them to recover, and traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress because of this prolonged stress, also like intestinal issues, insomnia, and chronic fatigue. So from the National Network of Female Defenders, we also seek to look beyond physical violence, because we have to be able to see the whole impact of the attacks against human rights defenders, female human rights defenders, and we look at it in an integrated way, look at the psychosocial impacts and what impacts on their family, social impacts that have in the lives of women defenders. That's what I wanted to share to open the space here today. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Aleida, por presentarnos este tan grave panorama.
Thank you so much for introducing such a hard landscape, the different types of aggressions and the groups that are working, and how important is the documentation work that you carry on. Without that information, without that data, without that documentation, it's so hard to have the right answers, the appropriate responses for these attacks and aggressions that you've mentioned. So thank you so much for that documentation work that you carry out. So I would like now to invite Elizabeth Mosqueda to take the floor. Mario and others have talked about the protection mechanism from the start, the story of it. I would like to hear from you about how it works in practice. How does this mechanism go? It sounds like a huge word. It sounds very complex, but in practice, the mechanism itself, how does it work? Can you tell us a bit of the challenges that other panelists have mentioned? How is it answering or not to this context that they've presented and that you're living nowadays? Thank you so much, Javier. Such a pleasure to be here. And of course, I join saying hello for everybody that's here today in the panel, Mario, Hugo, Aleida, and the people joining us in the transmission. We know we're taking to territories in this exercise of sharing, of analysis about the need of reinforcing the protection mechanisms in general, which is what I would be discussing today, such as other exercises, such as the National Network and other exercises or collective exercises in guaranteeing the life, the freedom, the dignity of the people that we defend human rights, all of us. So Mario gave very important information about this mechanism that is ascribed to the governance secretary that defends human rights defenders and journalists, and from 2012. And it talks about the citizenship work that bore fruit in this mechanism, and the result that after this decade, more than a decade existed, more than 2,300 people in general, and journalists that are inside these mechanisms. And so to understand that, we have the mechanism also because this is an exercise, a collective exercise, a citizenship exercise from the organizations, particularly regarding the articulation of the space and Espacio OSC and all the organizations that are part of it. Is fundamental to go on fostering those spaces to improve this. And it's a mechanism that it gives protection measurements of security measures, to guarantee the accompaniment of these people that are in imminent risk. So very technical terms to describe that, but to inscribe that oneself in one, you can do it by a mail or a phone call. In the websites of the governance secretariatship, you have the data to be able to access the a formal request. I think is mecanismo@cego.mx, and okay, it's an email, and it's you can follow it. You can get it from an email. You can do it directly through these communication channels, and you need to detail very clearly what is a situation that takes you to request the ascription to this mechanism to try to carry out an assessment of protection and security, and you can also do it through an organization that accompanies you. And I think we're sharing in the part of the consortium, we're part of the mechanism as beneficiary people and beneficiary collectives, but we also have experience accompanying other cases in 2 territories in which we are present. It's also important to include the basic data about the situation that the activities that are happening, that the people that identify with it, the context of the risk, and also to call if it's especially urgent. It is a process that is administrative process that is part of the organization's observations that we carry out, that we monitor to make it more robust, that the exercise of the mechanism should be easier and should answer to the demands, the needs of the people who are human rights defenders at risk, especially in the context that we've already has been shared. It's important to carry out, to describe the threats, the aggressions that you're living, the context of attacks, and to attach all the documentation, screenshots, and think of all the examples that she was mentioned, that my colleague was mentioning before. There are many virtual attacks and communications like screenshots and witness reports about the whole situation to be able to obtain most information for the analysis and to do an analysis of risk, to be able to determine what kind of measures are necessary and could be assigned. And in the formalities, you should share if the cases are categorized as urgent, they will have a response in theory in 24 to 48 hours. We would be like a report, like in a percentage, how fast they are. And in those cases that are not considered urgent or an imminent danger, they will take like a follow-up from 10 to 30 working days, depending on the complexity of the interinstitutional cooperation that can be provided. So the mechanism in the federal level and the different federative entities, and that they have their specific characteristics according to the context and a bit like the conditions of the people that are at that moment in those instances. Yeah. So I also like to take this chance to share that we talk about the mechanism, the security measures, and I think it's also key to detail some of these measures that are directed to urgent measures, the prevention and the physical and technological prevention measures, or the structural prevention measures for those people that for those activities that put the risks of those people that defend human rights at risk. well, the part of temporarily mobilize people to move people around, installing protection, surveillance cameras, also protection in homes and offices, and other measures that were mentioned, Mario mentioned, such as work tables and all institutional accompaniment, interviews with local authorities, with public attorneys, the recognition of the work of human rights defenders publicly, and the protection measures and security, but that also would be one of the things that should be evaluated as an organization. We should follow up of the cooperation in the mechanisms is that generally those that are happening less, those that have to do with prevention, with the low profiles, and it would be important there to reinforce that, not to be just in an exercise of reactive response to risk, but that we can also transform our approach from where we carry out this construction of this approximation of the mechanism, right? I will leave it there because I think it's important to share these technicisms, but in this space to tell you about the experiences, what this can be improved, what are the results of the focus that are needed, because I think these measures are really important. Thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for explaining how it works and how it goes from, from paper to real life. It's quite complicated. It's good that you can explain that process to us and all the process that is behind that. Before we go on, I would like to say that since we've heard from all our panelists, we also have the chance at the end. You have the possibility. You're going to have the possibility of asking questions. There'll be a Q&A, but you can write your questions in the chat, and that is here in the option. You have the Zoom chat. You can ask them in English or in Spanish, so that they can be answered at the end of the presentations. And before that, I would like to go back to Aleida and taking it from what Elizabeth said for the mechanism of protection and how it works. I would like to see how, for example, from your experience, what do we need to strengthen, and how do you carry out these cases? And how it was also mentioned by Elizabeth before, we have this focus on the reactive instead of the preventative. So I would like to know how you incorporate. You also discussed how is the context incorporated in these attacks are happening, the different cultural or identity different identities are the practices of the communities and the organizations in this mechanism. So if you could tell us a bit how, from the experience that you have and that you said, and how it works, how should we strengthen that? So it's a mechanism that really gives a complete response to the situation that is happening.
Sí, muchísimas gracias. Bueno, pues desde la Red Nacional de Defensoras hemos, y por lo que ya compartí, ¿verdad? No solamente por el tipo de agresión que están viviendo las defensoras.
Not just talking about the sorts of attacks that human rights defenders and journalists face, but the impacts because of all of this exhaustion, the way that they are being re-victimized constantly, that make the situation that they are facing worse and the exhaustion that they face worse. And so we identified the need for institutional support to have this integrated approach that incorporates a gender perspective, to recognize the different problems that women face, the expertise in recognizing the violence that they face and to be able to do an in-depth analysis of the context in which these attacks are taking place and the real context that human rights defenders are living in when they're defending rights, women human rights defenders. And so the collective focus as well that is included within the legislative framework for the protection of human rights defenders and journalists, but we need to make it put it into practice rather than leaving it in the theory. And so it's spaces for self-care, solidarity, public campaigns that raise the profile of the important work that human rights defenders do and recognize them as rights holders, subjects, not objects and not victims. But so we need these, rather than having these campaigns that are always delegitimizing, the ones that recognize and promote their work. And so internally, we need to include this gender focus, the intersectional focus, eco-social focus, and all of these different focuses, all of these different approaches and all these different focuses of human rights. In the internal normative, this principle of not re-victimizing these people all the time, all the defenders that we know when we see human rights violations, but the bureaucratic processes and all of this. People within the mechanism change, there's lots of turnover, there's a lack of institutional communication, and this can lead to repeat victimization of the defenders who are already in this very risky situation, and they're re-victimized over and over again. And so we've got to, if you look at the intersectional and gender focus, we've got a guide to include that. There's an internal glossary for how to include that focus, and that's a very important advance in this subject, in this matter. And they developed it from the Equipa, which was a civil society driven space, but there are some challenges to that being properly implemented. We don't want it just to be guided, and they need to be turned into specific protocols so you can know how to deal with these different impacts, particularly the issue of feminicide that I was talking about before, and the way that people are labeled, and to make sure that women who are facing risk are properly cared for. And so it needs to be coordinated and something that supports and strengthens the activities of the mechanism. There are some institutions that could get involved within this integrated response. Right? So I don't have much time, but I'd like to focus on the importance of the gender focus for questions of times. From the network, we believe that this focus is crucial for the protection mechanism, and not only in terms of language. It's not just a checklist. It can't just be a checklist for saying like there's a woman that's facing violence or attacks at home. It needs deep analysis of the reality of the women themselves and also the organization they work. And so to be able to really understand the risk, like Ellie was mentioning, to be able to have measures that are tailored to that specific person, because attacks against women defenders and journalists, it's not a one size fits all. Like violence can have many different patterns, and it doesn't always respond to, there's not always the same thing when we're talking about feminicide, like attacks against women. So there's some of the data that I gave you at the beginning is a number of feminicides and trans feminicides against farmers. 2019 to 2025 were 18, and so there are different attacks. There's the Latin American Protocol for the investigation of violent killings because due to gender. And they have highlighted human rights defenders, women human rights defenders, as people extremely vulnerable to this risk. And so we need to be able to, it's the different institutive bodies that need to identify violences or like that lead up to these killings. So the different sorts of attacks that lead up to these killings. And we need to be able to analyze these contexts with the gender focus to try to prevent this from happening. And this is something the mechanism needs to do, involving its this involvement of a gender focus. And so basically, you've got new numbers, but we need this contextual analysis, a complex analysis, and this continuity of violence along throughout time of the different cases. And this highlights that to identify gender violence is a duty of the state, and they need to be able to develop appropriate protection measures to be able to prevent these attacks from happening. And so the protocol will help the involvement in indicators into the risk analysis. So yeah, it's not, so you also look at prior attacks, you talk about it in the interviews, but it's not reflected in the risk assessment. So in the interviews, they talk about these things, but then it's included into the risk analysis. And so that's something that needs to happen. We talk about the risk that women, human rights defenders and journalists face is different, and it needs to be identified and the proper indicators implemented to ensure this form of prevention. And prevention is something key that Ellie mentioned. It's not just about reacting to attacks that have happened. We've got to have a preventive focus. And that is something that we're really promoting from the National Network of Defenders. So thank you, Aleida, for this. Yeah, it's always a challenge because these different risks, that gender-specific risks, and there's not just one response. Often there's just this stock response, and that's not what you need is an integrated response that actually is tailored to the specific situation of the individual. And it's and the importance of not repeat victimization and avoiding repeat victimization, because so often you have to keep repeating the same story once and again to maintain within the protection mechanism. And so thank you for highlighting that and giving us various ideas about how to strengthen the protection mechanism. And so now I wanted to come back to Mario. So this is a question that I think would be particularly interesting for our Canadian audience or our audience in Canada. So what are the impacts of mega projects that are supported by Canada, that have Canadian company involvement, such as in mining or in pipelines or in train lines or railways? So how could the protection mechanism respond to the impacts that commuters are affected by these sorts of mega projects, and so who are negatively impacted by this? Can it be a tool to respond to these sorts of risks and threats that people face as a result of these mega projects? So thank you for your question. It's a very complex thing to answer in a couple of minutes, but I'll give you an idea. And so this, particularly because of the concern. So violence against human rights defenders and journalists doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in very specific contexts where you've got different interests that all come together: economic interests, state interests, institutional interests, and also institutional impunity. And so with extractive projects and infrastructure, there's lots of Canadian interests, particularly in mining. And there's a lot of Canadian companies involved in mining. It's one of the biggest in the international companies in the country and also in the region, and a lot of them in indigenous territories. A lot of them haven't gone through the proper free, fair, and informed consent, and they've had huge social, cultural, and environmental impacts. And so there's huge impacts on the companies, criminalization of protests when communities oppose the imposition of these projects, oppose them. And so it impacts on the environment and violating the rights of indigenous people, as well as the attacks against journalists who are documenting these things in compliance with their role. And so just give you some specific cases. There's various cases. I will give you 3 specific cases. One is the Los Filos in Guerrero. So this is the Equinox Gold. It's a Canadian company, and there's constant issues with indigenous communities because of the environmental impacts and the way it's affecting their access to water. There's also the presence of criminal groups and human rights defenders who are demanding consultation, reparations, threatened, harassed, and have threats against their life. And so can't limit these people. They require measures. So the protection mechanism needs to respond to this in a community way, and there needs to be something that's effective. So unfortunately today, there's a lot to do in the federal protection mechanism in terms of a community response for protection. There's El Progreso in Oaxaca, which is linked to the Fortuna Mining, the Canadian company, and that has been killings, attacks against human rights defenders, acts of criminalization, and also fragmentation of the community about those who are in favor of the mining initiative and those who are against. And there is continued risk for the leaders and journalists who are documenting the impacts of this project. And so this case shows that there's been no sanctions and they're completely without justice. And so the protection measure has done nothing. So they're just doing palliative measures. So one of the things that we've said a lot, not to the mechanism in specific because it's lots of different bodies, but because also the General Attorney's Office is also involved, but they need to be much more proactive in the investigations when violations have taken place. And so they usually reduce the risk that the company poses, and they just give palliative measures without really seeking justice for the communities. And so when crimes are committed against offenders, then they really need to push forward with the investigations into that. And so there's San Pedro in San Luis Potosí, which is linked to Nuevo Gold, which is another Canadian company, and then a long court case. And so they found in favor of the community, but the aggression here is this using the court system, because lots of don't see it as an attack because they're not attacking the life of people. But it can be sullying somebody's name, but also attacking people, attacking their economic viability and also freedom. And so in this way, what we've said is that the mechanism should also be much more proactive in this sense, in coordinating with the public defense bodies when human rights defenders are being criminalized in this way, and providing them with a much better defense, and also support to victims and making sure that they have proper representation and giving them support in the costs that are involved in civil or criminal cases when they're criminalized in this way. And so So very common patterns. So projects that are imposed without any guarantees, criminalization of the defensive rights, a response, state response that's very fragmented. So when we face with this, the protection mechanism is indispensable, but at the moment it is completely failing to do what it does. It needs to get stronger in this phase, and it needs to be much more active and collaborate much better with the other bodies that are involved, institutions that are involved. And so it needs to be a proactive, and so community, individual, in all of these different ways. It needs to be an integrated approach. And so many of these risks are territorial and collective, and it needs to recognize that. And so therefore, the protection measures must cover these areas and not just individual protection measures. And so in a country where 90% of crimes against human rights defenders and journalists are not brought to justice, this injustice means that there's no guarantees for non-repetition. And so they need to coordinate with other bodies in the state and also recognize the role of transnational companies. And there needs to be things relating to due diligence in terms of human rights. And so with mega projects, such as the Canadian involvement in Mexico, they often happen in these areas of conflict. But so you need to have this integrated policy to deal with it. So they also need to seek to create situations in which human rights defenders and journalists can do their work safely. And it's not the favor of this isn't a favor the state is giving them, it's the state's duty. And so, and also the state needs to work together in all of its different instances to make sure that this response actually protects human rights defenders. And then, so at least to talk about what would it mean to actually integrate the protection mechanism into all of these different bodies in environmental issues, the environmental impact consultations, identification of risks, all the channeling of cases. All of these different bodies need to take a proactive role, and they need to work together through education, awareness raising, prevention, and all of these different things. And so also make a call that if all of these different actors work together, then you can be a bit stronger and also increase the willingness of the higher level bodies in the state to be to make sure that investment, human rights, the rule of law and protection can actually be promoted, and also to ensure that human rights defenders and journalists can be safe in their work. Thank you, Mario. It's been a very complicated question, but it's been a very interesting and complete response. It's very interesting when the impacts of companies and the criminalization is something that we're seeing increasing in many parts of the world. And the responses, the way that the states have to respond in terms of protection. So now I want to go back to Hugo, and we just wanted to know a bit about, from civil society organizations' perspective, what experience have you had with international cooperation, and if they've managed to strengthen institutions that form part of the protection of human rights defenders and journalists? Have there been any positive experiences, any challenges that you faced? Talking about international cooperation, what's your experience been there in talking about the support and participation of international cooperation to strengthen this? We've often heard that you need a lot of resources and support. So we also ask the international community to participate, and so how do you see it?
Sí, claro. Para iniciar esta respuesta también me gustaría
Well, to start answering
decir
this, I would
que
like to say
actualmente el
that
espacio OSC
currently
se encuentra en un
this
programa
space,
haciendo un
Espacio
soporte
OSC,
técnico, en un
is a
programa de
technical support in
fortalecimiento
programs for
a esta
strengthening
instancia del mecanismo de protección que es el Consejo
on the
Consultivo
request of
de la
the
mano de la Oficina del Alto
protection
Comisionado de las
mechanisms
Naciones
with the
Unidas para los
consultative
Derechos
council
Humanos
of the
y es un proceso que
Office of
pues
the
está
High
en paso,
Commissioner
¿no?
of Human Rights
Y
of the
un
United
poco
Nations
también
is a
en este
process that
tenor
is happening
hemos
right now.
tenido la experiencia de
And
colaborar con
we've
la misma Oficina
also
del Alto Comisionado y
we have with
asesoramiento con
this
el proyecto para la
cooperation with
protección de
this Office of the
personas
High
defensoras y
Commissioner and
periodistas
the projects for the
PBI
protection of human
USAID,
rights
que
defenders and
está
journalists,
ya la
and
lamentablemente extinta
the
agencia de
PV of
cooperación, que
USAID,
tenía vínculos
which is
con algunas
sadly is
organizaciones
extinct.
en
We had
México
links with some
y
organizations in Mexico, and
específicamente
especially
me
and
gustaría hablar de
specifically,
lo que se
I would like to
conoció
talk about what is
como
known
el grupo de
as
trabajo para el
the work group
fortalecimiento del
for the
mecanismo de
strengthening of the
protección para
mechanism of
personas
protection
defensoras
for human
de
rights
derechos
defenders,
humanos y periodistas.
of human
Un
rights
poco
and
poniendo en
journalists.
contexto de qué
As a
fue y qué rol
context, what it
tuvo
was
este
and the
equipo de
role that it
trabajo y en
had, this
específico
work group,
sociedad
and
civil como
specifically
Espacio
the
OSC.
civil society
En el
as
año
Espacio OSC. So in
2019, a petición del
2019,
gobierno mexicano, la Oficina
the
del Alto
journalist
Comisionado
of
realiza
the
este
Mexican government,
diagnóstico del funcionamiento del mecanismo
the
de
Office of the High
protección,
Commissioner created
en el
this
cual, para no
diagnosis
ahondar en detalles técnicos,
that they carried out.
este
That's just shown
diagnóstico
in the
es
camera,
público, puede
and
ser
this is
consultado de
public,
manera
so you
libre.
can
Y para
freely
no ahondar en
check it.
detalles, en tecnicismos,
And without going
este
into much
diagnóstico
technical
emanó
detail, this
104
diagnosis had
recomendaciones y
104 recommendations,
127
and
subrecomendaciones
127
para el
of those
fortalecimiento integral del
sub-recommendations
mecanismo de
for the
protección.
comprehensive
En
strengthening
este
of the
sentido, a
protection
partir del
mechanism. In that
2019, con la
sense, from
publicación de este
2019, with the publication
diagnóstico,
of this
2020 y
diagnosis,
2021,
in
sociedad civil y la Oficina
2021,
del Alto
civil
Comisionado
society and the
realizaron los
Office of
respectivos
the High
trabajos de
Commissioner, they carried
incidencia e
out
interlocución
this
para que
advocacy
en el año
work
2022, a
so that in
través de un mandato
2022,
constitucional,
through a
se diera la
constitutional
creación
mandate,
por 2
we had the
años de vida
creation for 2 years
de el denominado, el que ya mencioné,
of what
grupo de
is
trabajo para el
mentioned,
fortalecimiento del
the group for
mecanismo.
the strengthening of the
Este
mechanism.
grupo de trabajo constaba
And this
técnicamente
work
de,
group
durante
technically
estos 2
had,
años, a
during
partir
these
de
2 years,
septiembre del
from
2022
September
hasta
of
septiembre del
2022 to
2024,
September
las
2024,
instituciones que forman
like the
parte del CEN,
institutions that
el
were
Consejo
part
Ejecutivo
of
Nacional del Mecanismo,
the National Executive
el
Council of the
programa
mechanism, the
PDP de
PDP
USAID, la
program
Cooperación
from USAID, from
Norteamérica.
USAID, from the United
Éramos en ese
States.
entonces 15 organizaciones de
We
la
were
sociedad
15
civil,
organizations
muchas
from the civil society, many
pertenecientes
of
al
them
espacio OSC. Nos
belong to
reuníamos mes
Espacio
con mes
OSC. We
en
met
las instalaciones de
monthly,
Secretaría de Gobernación
and the
para dar
government
avance, para
secretary
dar y generar estas
offices
estrategias de
to generate
implementación y sus
these strategies
respectivos
for
medios de
implementation and
verificación de
their
todas estas 104
verification
recomendaciones y 127
methods from these
subrecomendaciones.
104 recommendations,
Esto, además
127
de ser un espacio de
sub-recommendations
cooperación,
in
no
a
solo,
space of
se mencionó por
cooperation,
los
not just, as I
agentes y
mentioned,
actores que
because
estaban
of the
involucrados,
agents and
no
actors
solo un
that were
espacio de cooperación
involved,
técnica,
not
sino
just a
también era un
technical
espacio
cooperation
de
space,
gobierno
but
abierto,
also
¿no? Había un
a space
diálogo
of open
directo, franco,
government.
con
There
organizaciones de la
was
sociedad
a
civil en
direct,
espacios
open
o con
dialogue,
tomadores de
very frank
decisiones al
dialogue with
interior,
in
cuando
spaces with
menos en el
decision
ejercicio
makers,
del
and at
mecanismo de
least
protección
of the
federal.
protection mechanism.
Como ya se hizo mención,
And
este
it
grupo de
was
trabajo
mentioned, this
tuvo desde un
working group
inicio
from the
por
beginning
mandato constitucional
had
una duración de 2 años. Ya
constitutional
en
mandate,
vísperas de septiembre, a finales
a
del
term of 2 years.
2024,
So,
como
but in
sociedad
September of
civil
2024,
realizamos
as civil
también una
society,
serie
we
de
carried out a number
estrategias de
of
incidencia para tratar de
strategies for
mantener
advocacy
vivo
to try
este
to keep
grupo de
it, this
trabajo.
group, a working group
Sin embargo,
alive.
no fue posible,
However, it was
entendiendo
impossible.
también que la
We understood
existencia
also
o no
that the
de este grupo
existence
de
or no
trabajo,
of this
más
working
allá
group,
de los
further
resultados
from that, the
que
results
arrojó, dependía
that
también
it gave,
muchísimo de la
it also
voluntad
depended a lot
política
of
de
the
determinados
political will
actores, ¿no? Al
of
interior
a
del
number of
mecanismo.
actors
En este sentido, para
internal to the mechanism.
2024, cuando
So from
culminan las
2024,
actividades del
when
grupo
these
de trabajo,
activities of
de
the
estas
working group finished,
104
from these
recomendaciones, el grupo de trabajo
104 recommendations, the
priorizó
working group
89 de estas. Y de estas
prioritized
89 se
89.
tiene
And from those
contabilizado a
89,
través de un informe a
we
2
have a
años,
report that has been
concluyendo el grupo de trabajo que se
carried out that
implementaron
years that
29 recomendaciones en su
29
totalidad.
of these
De igual
recommendations
forma, 41 de
were
estas
completely
recomendaciones presentaron algún avance
complied with.
sustancial.
41 of them
El
presented
resto
some
pues quedaron en
advances,
un
and the
estatus de
rest was
no
a status
priorizables
of
por parte
not
de
prioritized
grupo de trabajo. Y
by this
pues
group. And so,
aquí con esta experiencia nos queda
with this
también un sabor un
experience,
tanto
the taste in our mouth is a bit sweet and sour, because even though we carried out some specific actions by the working group, like for example the increase of the staff inside the mechanisms, there were meetings between the federal mechanism and the federative entities with respective mechanisms. And like Aleida mentioned, and the creation of the Arequipa as a group of making it transversal, the gender perspective in all the phases of the decision-making process in the mechanism, and not just a goal in itself, but just a first effort to make this perspective, to mainstream this perspective. And in the same way, they carried out certain of capacitation exercises and new regulations inside the mechanisms. But as a conclusion of this work, as it was this effort to recognize of integrating the civil society in this strengthening process, we identified when finished as a number of structural challenges that persisted. And for the up to this dialogue that we had, and was mentioned before, it's not the first time that I mentioned this here, which is the difficulty for the federal mechanisms to implement measures and generate protection plans with a collective and communitarian focus. There are some individual measures that could affect or and specifically diminish the levels of aggression. And this collective and communitarian effort is still an area of strengthening of opportunity for the federal mechanisms, because it has been mentioned, and there's a role in implementation of the strategies of implementation that are they have a lot of shortcomings when it comes to reality but the violence that both journalists and human rights defenders face. And one of the structural challenges that were identified in this working group was operational and as human beings. There are like 8 risk analysts for the universe of analysis that they have to carry out. So this difficulty in structural operations has a direct impact in the risk that can be generated by the mechanism. And also, as it was mentioned several times, the mechanism acts reactively mostly once the aggression has already happened, and there's this need to implement this preventative focus in all of the plans of the federal mechanisms. And just to mention this exercise from the working group, I wanted to mention the recent speaking tour with PBI that we carried out to generate similar exercises to create alliances, partnerships with agents that can cooperate technically or in finance, but mostly technical with the Mexican government. And this precedent will be a new exercise. It has already its history, and as I mentioned earlier, it has also had its successes in talking in matters of international cooperation. And I would leave it here. Well, thank you, Hugo, for your presentation and the importance of those spaces of real participation, and that sometimes and this difficulty that they had, like how they really become real impacts in real life, and the international community can work on that. And the time that we've seen, it was so hard, where many of the budgets are being cut, and international cooperation is focused on different topics and other topics. And there's a huge crisis in the Office of the High Commissioner itself, with a crisis of financing. So these are impacts you can start to see them clearly in the capacity that they have to carry out their work. And thank you so much for mentioning the speaking tour for PBI Canada. It was very important to have this speaking tour last year, in September last year, to see how from Canada we can support these protection mechanisms and the work of human rights defenders from Canada and the meetings that we had with members of parliament and with the space of participation with the Canadian government. I'm going to go now to a question for Elizabeth, Hugo, Aleida, whoever wants to answer first regarding your personal experiences with the protection mechanism. How do you live it day to day? And from the experience that you've had, you've faced many of them, but many of them that have not been faced on aspects that you could improve through the personal experience that you may have lived. How is it? How does it work to be a beneficiary of this mechanism on a daily basis? Whoever wants to answer that question, please raise your hand. And who wants to answer first this question?
Elizabeth,
I see you're ready to answer, so I'm going to give you the floor. So let's make it fast so we also have time for the Q&A. And then we have the conversation amongst the people who are here. Well, from the Oaxaca Consortium, we share that this experience is not different from what has been said earlier. As part of the organizations that we accompany, we have these cases, and it's not very different from what the exercise of the defenders at the network do. And we think it's important to go on getting better from the consortium because we are in this mechanism, federal mechanisms, after death threats that were received by the organization in our facilities. So one of the reflections that we have as beneficiaries of the mechanism is just the complexity of being a collective agent when there is a risk analysis with a perspective that is individual. So for us, much of the exercise of adjustment of these measures that we have right now, as we were described as an organization in the mechanism, it goes through these reflections. How cannot we cannot go and guarantee a risk analysis that is not personalized, that is just a focus a specific person that is the spokesperson in the organization, but as an organization, everything that we do, everybody that is in the organization, we contribute to our work, and then we are also at risk. So we have to understand these collective risks that we face as an organization is a bit complex because of the way the mechanism works. So for us, it's very important the concession and deconcession of these panic buttons, which is one of the measures. You have this button for assistance, and it's the people that carry out like the follow-up of the cases in our group, that the assignation, the allocation of those panic buttons is not thought for the people that are part of a community, like everybody that's part of the group. So these allocations of these panic buttons are done on a role basis. So these are the people that are considered to have like a risk in the community, and they have that panic button individually. And so we've had then, they require some dialogue to carry out this, to reallocate the buttons in the team. So as beneficiaries, we need like this intersectionality perspective of gender, of cultural identity as a need, and to reinforce also what the flexibility that is required in the context. Like measures have to be based on the context, because it's not the same to do a monitoring when we go to a demonstration in the capital of Oaxaca. That implies certain risks and certain possibilities. But when we go to risky territories, that complies with many of the characteristics that were mentioned inside the communities, in the defense of land and territory, with like a windy road where there's no coverage. So it's not that's effective to have like a panic button there when we're going on monitoring missions. And we should take that into account. I would also like to mention like the technical failures, because many of the measures like the cameras fail, the panic button can fail as well. Actually fails very often. And we have a lot to report just because of this not working. So the way, apart from what we've said of the way that they are located, many things that fail from what we see as people that are accompanied. So these considerations as an experience as as a collective entity, understanding that one of the agents that we are closest is the state. And so that's a difference in context depending on where the federal mechanisms and goes in like a breath of fresh air, and it can generate protection mechanisms with guarantees when from the state government, and also the security in supervision of some activities if it hasn't worked, to consider the positive impact to answer of these alerts of public activities. And we could see that something is quite functional, and to recognize that many of the measures have been adjusted through the dialogues from the consultative board, and the mechanism has had like spaces where they've been able to discuss how to adjust these needs. I will leave it there.
So thank you, Elizabeth. It's so important to talk about the need for a collective response when you've got this individualized approach, but also the different issues with the technical issues. I don't know if Hugo or Aleida, we don't have much time, but I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit about your experiences under the protection mechanism. Yes, thank you. I would just add a bit. So I am a beneficiary since 2014. I've been a beneficiary of the mechanism since 2014. And so I've seen how it's strengthened, it got better at the gender focus and how it's evolving. But I've also seen like the cuts and how that's impacted on their capacity. But what I'd like to share, I would also like to support, I agree with what Elizabeth said, but the protection of families, the families of human rights defenders. My family does have protection measures. That's not a reality for many human rights defenders and journalists. And we've seen that is a big challenge. So because many female defenders are attacked through their family members, their children, other family members, and so they attack them, and the families are often left out of the protection plans. But in my case, my family does come under the protection mechanism. And so we've asked for this child and this gender focus, all of these different transversal focuses, and looking at the different activities and contexts that my family are in, and they're receiving that protection. And I think that's what I would add, particularly thinking about the different cases that the network supports and companies. That's one of the focuses that really concerns us, particularly with the mujeres buscadoras, so the women that are looking for the disappeared, and the attacks against children at time that they are out searching for missing family members. And so, yeah, and so their family members need to be included. So yes, thank you. It's something that's often not mentioned, the impact on people's families. And obviously, often family members are a target of these attacks. And so it's so important that they also get protection measures, as well as the person who's actually exercising human rights defenders. And when you're talking about women buscadoras that have to go away for a long period of time when they're out searching, and what that means for their families and the whole of the community as well. And so, yeah, the protection measures need to be inclusive in that way. So thank you so much for adding that, Aleida. I don't know, Hugo, if you want to say something quickly, and then we'll go on to the next question. So, yeah, let us know. So, very quickly, I'll just add some things about our experiences. And so, perhaps for us, with collective measures, with the federal mechanism and the experience that we've had in accompaniment with these local mechanisms, particularly with the state of Mexico local one. With the federal mechanism, we've had some difficulties that have been mentioned because of the issues with collective measures, the turnover of people. And so you've got people in the team, and then people get reassigned, and so that is something that's really, really heavy bureaucratically and so you need a lot quicker, and it's an issue. So with the recognition of the work of human rights defense by the mechanism, sometimes we've had to launch campaigns to raise the awareness about the campaign, so the protection mechanism actually recognizes them as a human rights defender. And that's something that Aleida mentioned. And so the role of the mechanism in when there's criminalization process, when people who are receiving protection measures, but they are then criminalized and they don't do anything. So we've seen that the mechanism can sometimes facilitate information to the people who are criminalizing the protected person. And so that's something that needs to change. So that's something that we really need to look at and find ways to tackle that and change that pattern. And so good things or benefits, so that do mitigate the risks, I guess, would be the best way to do it. And it goes in hand with something the Espacio CSO has pushed, and measures that sort of like protection policies rather than economic costs. And so the local mechanism in the state of Mexico has taken various training and awareness raising drives quite seriously, and that's been very helpful. And so that's something, and yeah, and it's been very important because the municipal authorities are some of the principal aggressors, and so that's some good practices and communications or working groups that develop local mechanism that help with companies and councils, helps to mitigate the attacks locally. But obviously, but really, it depends a lot on the political will of the specific actors involved and the legal framework in different states. So the Espacio OSC, it was just 20 entities that have an agreement with the mechanism, or some form of special protection. Oh, so no, that's in a different state. Sorry, it's only 20 states that actually have this sort of mechanism, so it depends there. So thank you. Thank you, Hugo, for explaining what you were commenting, of how it works locally or on a state level. And how, yeah, but protection is much more than panic buttons or other actions that have been mentioned, and how the political spaces, like sort of like awareness raising, training, and this can have a greater sort of impact on protection, because it can have a protective or preventive measure as well, and sort of like changing behaviors. And so I wanted to ask one last question to Mario, I think it was. Oh, no. So we've got PBI Canada and PBI Mexico. So we just got a message to all of you. And so have you got any message for the government of Canada in terms of the protection mechanism, or to the Mexican government, the things that they can take to support the protection mechanism? So any ideas in the very last minutes? So yes, there's lots to do, obviously. It's not something that will get resolved here in the territory. We need solidarity from many different sides. So from France, Spain, Canada. So yeah, it's to everybody who's been in this space and listening to us to amplify our voice and talk about it and comment on the things you've heard here about the different risks and the impacts that the companies have on indigenous territories, different communities, campesino communities, rural communities, and just yeah, so the risks that people face, but also the impact that has on the environment and and all sorts of different impacts that it has. And so yeah, the activities of companies from different places. We've looked at the Canadian case, but there's companies from many other continents and many other places that have this, and they need to take responsibility for the attacks that are either indirect or direct attacks that are linked to the mega projects that they're undertaking. And so, yeah, to pressure governments to provide greater oversight over these companies, to demand responsibility, accountability, and for also reparations to the people who were impacted by this. To the Canadian government, it was one of the countries that made a statement, and the recommendations talked about protection of human rights defenders. And so in this way, we want follow up on those recommendations, that it can't just be this statement that was made, but we need to follow up on this statement that they need to provide technical support to the Mexican government and to organizations and to civil society to help us to be able to continue in our work. And also the need to continue to provide cooperation and technical support to other bodies like the protection mechanism, to different attorney general's offices, attorneys' offices, and to civil society. And also a call to the society in Canada and other countries who are listening today to remain in contact with the organizations, with Consorcio Oaxaca, with the National Network, all of the different people that have been here to help us raise the voices of the defenders here and the people that they work with. It's the only way that we will ensure that any other actors that seek to attack us, who continue to attack us in many different ways that we've described today, feels, and to feel that we're not alone, and to raise the political cost of these attacks, because to show that people are looking from different countries in different places, and we're looking at the Mexican government, at all these companies, and they're watching what they're doing. Thank you, Mario, for what you're saying. So the different ways that you can raise the voices, disseminate the information, and the different steps that people can contribute to this process. And so we've had lots of questions in the chat. I think some of them have been responded to. We've got one here. So what is collective protection? How would you describe it? How did it come about? How can you actually form it? Can you give an example of collective protection, what it looks like, so people can visualize it? I don't know if anybody could quickly share anything on that. Elizabeth, you talked about collective. Maybe I'll pass it over to you now.
Bueno, yo daré ahí
Okay.
brevemente. Sí, yo creo que
Okay, yeah.
Y en realidad lo quisiera y la
So really,
importante que dijo Mario en este
I think
mensaje
it's
de
something
cierre,
that
¿no?
Mario
Las
said was very
acciones de
important in these
defensa,
closing words.
independientemente de que
Defense
estemos en
activities, whether in organizations that are like
carácter en el
formal
cual estamos
organizations, or if we're just organizing whatever way that we're organized, really,
de derechos humanos
defense of
viene
human rights defense
colectivo,
is
¿no?
collective.
Entonces,
It's a
también
collective
pensar que lo
act.
que hacemos no lo hacemos
So yeah, we don't do it on our own. It's not something that we do in isolation. We do it
haciendo sinergia con
making synergies with different people, connecting with other people, because the problems that we are fighting against structural issues, and they require these collective responses to be able to overcome. Like, we can't analyze these impacts in isolation or individually. So everything is collective on this level. So something that we're sharing from the things that we've lived through from the Consorcio Oaxaca. It doesn't matter the names that we have, it's all of us working together to try to achieve these changing that we're trying to achieve. And we're all living through the impacts of the things that we do. Like they're all collective. Aleida was sharing how it is with her. It's not her on her own, but her with all the different links that she has, forming part of the network with her family, with her friendships, forming part of a community. Everybody's affected in all of these. So thinking about the collective in the communities, indigenous peoples, different communities, affected communities, and yeah, and they have specific roles. But yes, and so the impact always impacts a whole community. And so the belonging to this land or this collectivity, this collective. And so you cannot just see the analysis or see saying you've got a panic button or this individual threat. It's always a collective thing. I'm not sure if anybody else has anything to add on that. So, Aleida?
Sí, muchas gracias. Pues yo
Thank you.
quisiera complementar con
I
un
would just like to
ejemplo, ¿no?
add with an
estas
example
necesidades de medidas colectivas.
about
El
the
caso, por
needs,
ejemplo, de
the
mujeres
collective
buscadoras, de
needs.
los
So
colectivos
with
de
the
buscadoras,
buscadoras,
hemos
so the people
acompañado
searching for
casos
their
en
disappeared
donde
people,
se
we've
ha
accompanied
asignado medidas
cases
de
where
protección a uno o dos integrantes de
protection measures have
colectivos,
only been given to one or
asumiendo,
two
¿verdad?,
members of the
que
collectives, and that
solamente
you've
los
got
riesgos los han
saying that
enfrentado
the
ellas.
risks, as
Y han
if it's
sucedido
just
casos
them
muy
that's facing the
lamentables en
risks.
donde ha habido
And so it's really they've
asesinatos contra
been
otros
killing sometimes
integrantes del
against
mismo
other members
colectivo
of these
y una
collectives,
negativa, ¿no?,
and
a
so
veces del
and also
mecanismo
the
por dar medidas
refusal
colectivas,
of the
¿verdad?
mechanism to provide collective
Incluso
protection measures
ser
to these
creativos,
collectives.
¿no?, en
You have to be
en la implementación de
creative in the
medidas que tal vez no
implementation
se
of
han
measures
pensado
because they've not
en
been
otros
thought of
momentos porque el
in
contexto tal
other
vez no nos
times
daba para
because
eso, ¿verdad? Sin
the
embargo,
context
ahora
wasn't to
pensando en
do that.
estos
But now
colectivos de madres
we think
buscadoras
about the
con
collectives of
actividades
Madres
muy
Buscadoras,
particulares, muy
the
distintas a
searching
las
women.
que
So you've got
podríamos
very
tener,
different
otros
contexts
perfiles de
that
defensoras,
other
nos
defenders may
invitan a
face.
ampliar la
So this
mirada,
is
¿verdad? Y estas
helping
necesidades
us
de
to look at
protección
the different
colectivas
needs and
sin
how
tener que llegar a
collective
la
protection
agresión,
measures could
¿verdad? Como
be.
comentaba Hugo,
So
Elizabeth,
like
Mario,
Hugo, Elizabeth and Mario have all
la
mentioned,
implementación de
the
medidas
implementation
preventivas,
of
¿no?
preventive
Y que
measures
eso
is
puede
key.
disminuir incluso
And this
costes,
could
puede
reduce
disminuir
costs
los
of the
impactos
protection
en las
mechanism,
defensoras sin
reduce the
tener que
impacts
llegar
on
a
human rights
tener que
defenders and
atender
journalists,
emergencias, ¿verdad? Como nos está
and reduce the
sucediendo
need to
ahorita. Este
respond
es
to
un ejemplo de
emergencies.
una
Because if you're
necesidad
managing to
de medidas
prevent the
colectivas
attacks from
y
taking
que responde
place,
a un
so
contexto
these
particular
preventive and
histórico de
collective
México, ¿verdad?
measures.
De
And so
una
yeah.
situación muy dolorosa como
And
la
so yeah, it's a very
desaparición y una
painful
necesidad
situation with
particular
so in Mexico
de
with the
medidas
disappearances,
para
and
estos
so to
perfiles, ¿no?,
having
de mujeres que están haciendo
mechanisms
labor de
for the
búsqueda.
people who are searching for their lost ones or their disappeared.
Muchas gracias, Aleida.
So
Yo creo
thank
que
you,
vamos, con
Aleida.
esto
I
vamos
think now
poniendo fin a
we
este
will
webinar.
start
Quisiera darle las
closing the
gracias,
webinar.
Elizabeth,
I just
Mario,
want to
Aleida y
say
Hugo.
thank you
También
to
un
Aleida,
agradecimiento
Elizabeth,
especial a Sandra y Bego que nos
Mario, and
ayudaron en la
Hugo, and thank you
interpretación.
to Bego and Sandra
Creo
for
que ha
the
sido muy
interpreting.
claro el webinar
I think
en
the webinar
abordar,
has been
¿no?,
very
los
clear,
desafíos, los riesgos
looking at
que
the
enfrentan
challenging, the
las personas
risks, the challenges
defensoras,
and the
las
risks that
comunidades en el
human rights
territorio, los grupos
defenders, communities
influenciados especialmente también
face,
las
the
mujeres
different issues
defensoras
that people
en
face,
México
particularly women defenders in
bueno, y
Mexico,
las necesidades que hay de
and the
protección y
needs,
el rol
the
que
protection
cumple el
needs that
mecanismo
they have,
importante,
and the
pero
importance of
también cómo
the
este
protection
mecanismo tiene que ser
mechanism, and
fortalecido,
ensuring
tiene
that
que ser
the
con la
mechanism needs
participación
to be
directa de
strengthened
las organizaciones
with
de
the
la comunidad
direct
en consulta
involvement of
con la incorporación según de los
organizations
contextos
and
propios
communities
y
with a
también la comunidad
tailored
internacional
approach in
tiene
each
mucho que
case,
aportar
and
y
that the
apoyar, ¿no?
international
Entonces creo
community
que
has a
esto
lot to bring to
es una
this
tarea que
too.
continúa. No
And
sabemos
so
que los
this is a
riesgos, las
dialogue that we
amenazas
need to
como las
continue,
cifras
a process
que
that needs to
nos
continue.
daba Aleida, los datos
The
compartían
data that
de
Aleida has given us,
amenazas
the
y de
numbers,
ataques es
about
tremendo y
attacks,
se
it's
necesita
terrible.
abordar todo el ciclo
We
de la
really need to
violencia que se da
deal with
en
the whole
México
cycle of violence in
desde
Mexico,
las causas estructurales de esta
from the
violencia
structural
a responder a
causes
los impactos que eso tiene
to responding to
tanto
the
a las
impacts
personas, los
of this
colectivos, las
violence
familias
on
como en los comentarios. Así que bueno,
individuals, collectives,
les
and
comentamos que
families.
mañana va a haber un
So
comunicado de
tomorrow
prensa que estará saliendo
there will be a
abordando
press
también
release
este tema y la
coming
importancia
out
del
talking
mecanismo.
about this
Entonces
subject, talking about the
les
importance of
invitamos
the
a seguir todas
mechanism.
las redes
So
sociales de las
we
diferentes
invite you
organizaciones
to
presentes
follow
en
all of
en
the
este
organizations
webinar
that are
y
present in this
en el chat
webinar who've been
encontrarán ahí
presenting here.
también
We'll put in the chat, we have put in the chat links so you can follow all of the organizations and stay in contact with all of us, follow the work of PBI, but also the other organizations that have been speaking with us today. But I won't keep you any more. Thank you, Aleida, Hugo, Mario, Elizabeth, and thank you to Sandra and Bego. Thank you so much for being here today. Please keep following us and accompany us in this campaign of no more attacks against human rights defenders and journalists in Mexico and throughout the whole world. Thank you so much for being here.